When I gave birth to Henry, I was just a girl. I thought I would die from the pain.
In the ancient paintings of royal courts, all we see are golden thrones, glittering crowns, and velvet robes woven with silver thread. But behind the silk curtain, in the shuttered rooms where no court musician plays and no royal decree enters, lies a different world, one where queens did not live as symbols of power, but died as sacrificial bodies. They did not fall in battlefields, nor were they poisoned by court intrigue. They died in their bridal beds, their bodies turned into vessels of dynasty, their last breath drawn, not in glory, but in blood. The most terrifying part, their deaths were not accidents. They were expected, built into the system. Their blood did not stain the battlefield, but seeped silently into the linens of royal birthing beds, dripping onto marble floors that shone with gold but lacked soap. Across more than 7 centuries of European history, dozens of queens, princesses, and noble consorts vanished, not with trumpets, but with silence, after fulfilling what was called their duty to the throne, a duty no one ever asked whether they consented to. Their world was one where death in childbirth was not a tragedy, but a statistical certainty. In the 13th century, 1 in every 3 women died during childbirth, and for a royal woman, the first thing she was expected to do upon learning of her pregnancy was not prepare a cradle, but write a will. The higher they climbed in status, the greater their risk, because instead of being attended by seasoned midwives, they were forced into the hands of royal physicians, learned men who understood nothing about female anatomy, some of whom truly believed that the uterus was just a man's organ turned inside out. These men, who carried titles like court surgeon or royal accoucheur, did not know bacteria existed, did not wash their hands, did not sterilize their tools, and when they intervened during childbirth, they often made things worse, tearing open wombs, worsening bleeding, or infecting their patient with their own unwashed fingers. The name of the disease that killed the most royal women was puerperal fever, a slow fever that began days after birth, reeking of infection, burning the body, and extinguishing life with brutal precision. No one heard their screams, because royal women did not give birth for themselves. They were required to give birth for the nation. And they were not just expected to produce children, they were expected to produce sons. From the moment they entered the palace, they were turned into human factories for heirs. To give birth to a girl was a disappointment. To give birth to nothing was to risk exile, imprisonment, or even execution. Royal marriages were not the start of love stories, but contractual agreements to procreate. And with every new child, their bodies weakened, but they were not allowed to rest. They were forbidden from breastfeeding their babies, told to hand them off to wet nurses, so they could preserve their figure and be ready for the next pregnancy. While common women were allowed to hold their infants, queens were forced to return to the king's bed before their stitches had even healed, restarting the death cycle that came disguised as tradition. And if you think royal privilege protected them, you are mistaken. It shackled them. A peasant woman could summon a wise old midwife from her village. A queen, however, had to deliver her child under strict ceremonial conditions, surrounded by court physicians and witnesses, under blinding candlelight and suffocating protocols. Those protocols killed many of them, and history recorded their names only as footnotes beneath the names of their husbands and sons. Women like Isabella of England, sent to Germany and locked in a foreign harem, died at 27, giving birth to her 5th child. Or Mary de Bohun, kidnapped as a girl, to bore 7 children in under 10 years, and died at 26. Elizabeth of York, wife of Henry VII and mother of Henry VIII, died on her 37th birthday after giving birth to her 7th child, a baby who lived only a few days. Jane Seymour, the only wife who gave Henry VIII a son, died 10 days after childbirth from infection. Catherine Parr, the 6th wife, survived the king but died after her first and only childbirth at 35. And worst of all, Princess Charlotte Augusta, the nation's golden girl, died in a pool of blood after 2 days of labor and a stillborn child, sending the entire kingdom into mourning and changing the line of succession forever. What chills us is not just the number of women who died, but the way they died. Silently, alone, in pain, stripped of voice, choice, and dignity. They died not as queens, but as vessels, instruments of power, victims of outdated science and patriarchal violence. No number of rubies on their fingers or emeralds around their necks could protect them from the scalpel, from the fever, from the crown-shaped coffin. They were handed power and then robbed of agency. And even as their portraits hung in gilded frames, their bodies lay buried beneath stone slabs, their names forgotten, except when tied to the sons they produced. So what is the meaning of a crown that cannot protect a woman screaming on her deathbed? What is the worth of a kingdom built upon the bleeding bodies of its mothers, and if their deaths are erased from memory? Are we not still repeating the same cycle of sacrifice, dressed in new clothing, but born of the same old cruelty? Are you ready to hear what comes next? Because the stories behind those velvet curtains only get darker. When people hear the word princess, they often picture satin gowns sweeping the floor, dainty diamond tiaras, and dreamy eyes gazing out from tower windows as if waiting for a tender destiny to arrive. But Isabella of England never lived in a fairy tale. She lived in a golden cage with no door. As the daughter of King John, remembered in history as a failed and bitter monarch, Isabella was sent to Germany at the age of 21 to marry Emperor Frederick II, a man nearly 20 years, her senior, twice widowed, and all too eager to turn her into yet another pawn on the imperial chessboard. Upon arrival in this foreign land, she was not welcomed with flowers or fanfare, but with isolation. All her English ladies-in-waiting were dismissed and sent home. In their place stood strangers, women of Arabic origin in the emperor's harem, watched over by eunuchs who did not speak her language. For 6 short years, Isabella endured this marriage of state, during which she bore 4 or 5 children, at least one of whom died in infancy. Her strength faded with each birth, her body chipped away by duty, and in the end, it was the birth of her last daughter that claimed her life. She died at the age of 27. There is no tender diary to remember her, no aching love letters, only a sparse line in royal chronicles that note her passing as the completion of her maternal obligation, as if death were the final clause in her marriage contract, as if she had fulfilled a task rather than lost her life. If Isabella's tragedy was one of foreign exile and quiet collapse behind guarded walls, then Mary de Bohun's story speaks to a different kind of sorrow, the tragedy of girlhood stolen too soon and weaponized in the name of succession. Mary was a noblewoman of Anglo-Welsh descent whose childhood was soaked in the calculations of adults who saw her not as a child, but as a token to be bargained, betrothed, and bound. She was kidnapped and married off to Henry, son of John of Gaunt, at just 12 years old. The union was initially supposed to remain unconsummated at least until she reached an age deemed appropriate, but fate intervened in a cruel and premature way. By the age of 16, Mary was pregnant. At 16, an age when most girls should be reading poetry by the window, or blushing over harmless flirtations, Mary was lying on a birthing bed. Her small body racked with pain. She could not understand. Her first child died within days. 6 more pregnancies followed, like waves battering a fragile shoreline. And Mary herself died at the age of 26, giving birth to her final child, a daughter named Philippa. Her death passed quietly. It was not until 5 years later, when her husband Henry ascended to the throne as King Henry IV after overthrowing and killing Richard II, that the court seemed to remember the queen it had lost before the crown had even been placed on her brow. One of Mary's sons would go on to become Henry V, the celebrated victor of Agincourt. But his name burned into English legend was first whispered in a chamber filled with the cries of a 16-year-old girl who had never been asked if she wanted to be a mother. Worse still, both of Mary's daughters, Blanche and Philippa, died during childbirth, as if fate had inscribed the curse of maternal death into their very bloodline. Some may call it genetics, or medical misfortune, or cruel coincidence. But perhaps the truth is simpler and more devastating. They were women, born into royalty, and therefore condemned to die for it. No one remembers Isabella and Mary as individuals with hopes or fears or voices. History does not record their laughter or sorrow, their favorite scents, or the moments they looked out a window and longed for freedom. They are remembered, if at all, as names beneath the names of men, as wives, as mothers, as noble women who died in childbirth. There are no statues raised in their honor, no epic ballads sung in their memory. They birthed in agony and died in silence, leaving behind sons who would shape the course of nations, while their own bones were buried under layers of cold cathedral stone. And if any whisper remains, it is not in the annals of kings, but in the wind, asking whether anyone remembers that they once lived, that they once wanted to survive, and that their deaths were not the result of motherhood, but of being forced into it too young, too often, and far too alone. When we look back at their stories, at the wide-eyed girl in a foreign harem, and the kidnapped child who bled out on her final delivery bed, we must ask how many other women have lived this same script, told that marriage is glory, that love will follow duty, that childbirth is destiny. How many have believed it, only to die in rooms where no one came to say goodbye? That question does not demand an answer. It leaves instead a long, aching silence. A silence filled with names the world forgot. A silence carved into the conscience of a civilization that once called this suffering noble. She was only 7 years old when they placed a crown on her head and sent her across the sea, dressed in silk and embroidery too heavy for her small frame. Her hands tucked in gloves that had been sewn for a woman, not a child. Her name was Isabella, daughter of King Charles VI of France, and her marriage was not a love story, nor even a political bargain between adults who understood what it meant. It was a treaty signed in flesh, to end the bloodshed of the 100 Years' War. The kings of France and England decided that peace should be sealed with a child, and so they gave Isabella to King Richard II, who was 22 years her senior, in what the poets called a truce, but history might call a sacrifice. She left her mother and sisters, her dolls and tutors, and crossed into a world where she was to be queen before she even knew how to read the word. Richard, to his strange credit, did not consummate the marriage. He treated her gently, even fondly. He visited her chambers and spoke kindly to her maids, told her stories, and gave her small gifts. But beneath that kindness lay a truth no one dared speak. Richard II was a king with no desire for women. He was known to favor the company of his male companions, beloved friends, whose closeness inspired both loyalty and rumor. The court gossiped. The nobles whispered. And Isabella remained untouched. A queen in title, but not in body. A child playing a role in a game she could not yet understand. There were no children born of that union. And perhaps that was a mercy. But peace does not last when it is built on the trembling shoulders of a girl. 4 years after their marriage, Richard was deposed and murdered in captivity. Isabella, still barely a teenager, was imprisoned by the new king, Henry IV, and when he tried to marry her off to his son, she refused, showing the only spark of resistance history allowed her to keep. For a moment, it seemed like Isabella might reclaim something of herself. But then came the second marriage. They called it suitable. Charles, Duke of Orleans, was her cousin. He was 11 years old. Isabella was 16. This time, the marriage was consummated, and this time, there was no reprieve. At 19, Isabella gave birth to a daughter. The birth was difficult. The air in the room was heavy. The blood came fast and would not stop. The doctors were helpless, whispering prayers over their instruments. And her ladies-in-waiting could do little but hold her hands and cry. She died as her child cried its first and only cry, a sound too soft to stop the silence that followed. Isabella of France, daughter, queen, widow, wife again, and finally, mother, was buried with the dignity her short life had not afforded her. Her daughter would not live long. Her name, like her mother's, would be swallowed by time. But what lingers about Isabella is not just the list of roles she played, nor the oddity of being queen to a man who loved someone else, nor even the tragedy of dying before her 20th birthday. What lingers is the question, how did the world not see her? How did the scribes who recorded her betrothal, her coronation, her transfer between kings, not pause for even a moment to wonder what she thought of it all? Did she cry the night she left Paris? Did she flinch when her second husband touched her? Did she know, in the moments before her death, that she had been used twice over for peace and power and lineage? Or was she too tired to care, too lost in the haze of blood and fever to hold on to anything but breath? There are no surviving letters, no whispered last words. There is only the echo of her name in the margins of men's histories, and a date of death written beside the phrase "in childbirth." And yet, for a girl whose life was offered as a treaty and whose death was forgotten by those who bargained her away, Isabella's story reaches out across the centuries, not with fury, but with the quiet ache of a childhood buried too early. Her tale is not just one of death, but of a life never allowed to begin. And in telling it, we are forced to look again at the illusion of royal safety, the lie that status protects, the cruel truth that in every palace, every nursery, and every bed of embroidered silk, there was still a woman or a girl lying there in pain, her body torn open, not by accident, but by design. It was never safe to be a queen. It was never safe to be the mother of an heir. And for Isabella of France, it was never safe to be a daughter, either. In portrait, she is the very image of grace, a serene face framed by flowing golden hair, eyes lowered in modest dignity, lips gently pressed in the quiet stillness expected of queens. Elizabeth of York was not a warrior queen, not a scandalous figure, not a voice that shouted to be heard. She was, if anything, the one who soothed a kingdom after years of war, the woman whose very existence was a bridge between two warring houses. She was born into the chaos of the Wars of the Roses, Her father, Edward IV, having seized the crown in a storm of blood, and her uncles and brothers embroiled in betrayals, disappearances, and death. Her life was shaped by the sharp edges of civil war. And when she married Henry Tudor, who became Henry VII, it was not a union of passion, but a political necessity designed to unite the feuding houses of York and Lancaster. The red rose and the white, two petals forced into a single bloom. And yet, fate wove something gentler into their marriage than the court had expected. Despite the cold calculations that brought them together, Elizabeth and Henry found a strange and quiet happiness. She, who had known what it was to lose brothers and flee palaces, found in him a man who, though cautious and haunted, respected her. He, who had built a kingdom from rebellion and exile, found in her a balm to his paranoia. They were never lovers in the way poems dream of, but they were companions, partners, and she gave him what he wanted most children: heirs, legitimacy carved into flesh and bone. Elizabeth gave birth to 7 children in all. That number, when spoken aloud, feels round and whole, as if it belongs in fairy tales, but the truth behind it is jagged. Only 4 of those children survived infancy. Her first son, Arthur, the Golden Boy, the symbol of hope for a new dynasty, was born after a long labor in the winter of 1486. His birth was celebrated across the kingdom, the court erupting with joy, feasts, and prayers. He was healthy, strong, and named after the legendary king whose spirit England had long hoped would return. Elizabeth smiled through the pain and wore her crown with quiet pride. But the births did not stop. She was queen. After all, producing heirs was not just expected, it was demanded. There was barely time for her body to recover between pregnancies. With every child, she stepped back onto the ledge of death. And with every survival, she must have whispered thanks to a God she could only hope was listening. Her daughters Margaret and Mary arrived. And then the second son, Henry, who would later become the infamous Henry VIII. But in between these bright lights were shadows, stillbirths, lost infants, nights spent in fever and silence, while the court waited outside the door. Then came the year 1502. Arthur, her precious eldest, the boy who was to become king, fell ill. He was 15. Fever gripped his young body, and no doctor could save him. Elizabeth, still recovering from another birth, watched as the promise of her years of pain and labor slipped away. He died, and the wind left her lungs. Henry, her husband, is said to have wept in her arms. And for once, the palace grew still, not out of ceremony, but mourning. But Elizabeth did not have the luxury of collapsing. Barely a year later, she was pregnant again. It would be her 7th child. The pregnancy was quiet. There were no great announcements, no fanfares. Perhaps she, too, had grown tired of celebration. Perhaps something in her bones told her that this would be the last. And it was, on the 11th of February in the year 1503. Elizabeth went into labor. The child, a girl, was born after a long and wearying effort. They named her Catherine. She lived only a few days. And Elizabeth, bleeding from within, fever rising in her skin, could not be saved. She died that night, on her 37th birthday. There were no candles, no cake, no music. The woman who had united 2 dynasties, who had given birth to a prince who would become the most feared king in English memory, died in the same quiet way. She had lived surrounded by ceremony but rarely seen. Henry was inconsolable. He locked himself in his rooms and did not speak for days. Their surviving children wept, not fully understanding what had been taken from them, and young Henry, the second son, who would grow to split the church and kill his wives, stood beside her empty bed and cried. It is said that her death, more than any battle or betrayal, planted in him the seed of obsession. A male heir, at any cost, a son who would survive, a woman who would not fail him. The echoes of Elizabeth's death would follow him through 6 wives, 2 beheaded queens, and a kingdom torn in half. But Elizabeth herself did not scream. She did not rage. There are no records of her resisting, no letters describing bitterness or defiance. She accepted her fate with the same calm that had marked her whole life. And perhaps that is what makes her story so haunting. Not that she died, but that her death was expected, that no one was surprised, that a woman could endure pregnancy after pregnancy, bleeding, mourning, and pain, only to vanish on the day of her birth. And the world would carry on without even knowing what to call that loss. The truth is, Elizabeth of York was a woman made of silence. She stitched her suffering into her smiles, wove her worries into tapestries, bore sons and daughters with grace, and vanished like a breath. Her legacy lived on, carved into stone, into portraits, into the red and white rose of Tudor. But the woman herself, the mother, the girl, the queen who once walked a corridor, humming lullabies to babies who would not wake, was buried beneath Westminster Abbey in a tomb far less grand than her grief deserved. And perhaps the final cruelty is this: she was not the first. She would not be the last. She was one of many royal women whose bodies were offered to the state and whose deaths were folded into the price of power. But she was also something more. She was the hinge between 2 centuries, 2 monarchies, 2 versions of England. And when she died, a door closed that would never again be opened with grace, only with force. She came quietly. No tempest, no scandal, no great fanfare. After the thunderstorm of Anne Boleyn, after the trial, the execution, and the whispers echoing through every gallery and chapel, Jane Seymour was like a hush that settled over the court, a white rose after a field had been scorched. Henry VIII chose her before Anne's blood had even dried. A pale girl from a noble but unremarkable family. Jane was everything. Anne was not demure, soft-spoken, obedient, and still untouched by the brutal theater of power that had consumed 2 queens before her. She had served both Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn as lady-in-waiting. She had seen what happened to women who displeased the king. And she had learned, when Henry first turned his eye toward her, Jane did not flirt. She did not fight. She simply waited. And that patience, whether born from calculation or survival, became her shield. He married her just 11 days after Anne's beheading. The court barely had time to catch its breath. Jane became queen in the spring of the year, 1536. She wore white, not in innocence, but in acceptance of the role. She now stepped into a role laced with ghosts and soaked in blood. Henry was no longer the man he had once been. His leg was ulcered, his temper erratic, his paranoia sharpened by betrayals, both real and imagined. But Jane had what no other woman in England had: the promise of peace. She pledged to heal the wound between the king and his first daughter, Mary. She stayed out of politics, never raised her voice, never challenged him in public or private. And most importantly, she gave him hope. Jane became pregnant the next year. The kingdom exhaled, as if it had been holding its breath for a decade. Since the death of Prince Arthur, and the long string of female births and failed pregnancies, England had wandered in a fog of uncertainty. Now, at last, a male heir seemed within reach. The bells rang, prayers echoed in every cathedral, and Henry, the same man who had murdered one wife and exiled another, was almost tender with Jane as her belly grew. But with hope came fear. The child was positioned wrong breech. The physicians knew it. The midwives whispered it. They could not fix it. Jane went into labor in the autumn of the year 1537, for 2 nights and 3 days. She screamed. The walls of Hampton Court held her cries like a cathedral, traps incense, sacred and heavy and lingering. Her body, never strong, began to fail. Her pulse weakened. But on the morning of the 3rd day, the child was born. A boy, healthy, breathing, a Tudor prince at last. They named him Edward. Henry wept. The court erupted in joy. Bonfires lit the sky. Verzogen. Nobles rushed to send gifts. The child was swaddled in gold-threaded linen, placed in a cradle carved from oak, and proclaimed the salvation of the realm. Jane, exhausted and torn, smiled faintly from her bed. It was the last time anyone would see her smile. She worsened slowly. Infection crept in, as it always did. Her fever speaked. Her belly hardened with swelling. Her breath grew labored. No one could help her. They had no antibiotics. They had no antiseptics. They had no understanding of the invisible hands that reached from unwashed fingers and bloodied cloth to claim her life. The midwives washed their hands in rose water. The doctors prayed. Jane lay still. She died 12 days after giving birth. She was 29 years old. Henry was devastated, or so he said. He locked himself away. He wore black. He commissioned a grand tomb, one meant for 2. Jane would be the only wife buried beside him. Historians would later argue whether he loved her most, or whether she was simply the only one who gave him what he wanted. But in the end, the distinction mattered little. Jane Seymour had done what no queen before her had managed. She had borne him a living son. And in return, the court called her virtuous, obedient, pure. She became a legend of quiet triumph, even as her body rotted beneath marble and brass. But if we scrape away the romantic veil, if we step back from the portrait and listen to the silence behind it, we find something more painful. We find a woman who endured 48 hours of labor, without intervention, who bled while the court toasted, who died while others planned her child's christening. We find a mother who never got to hold her son without pain, a wife whose reward for obedience was infection and fever. We find the truth that even in triumph, a queen could die alone. And what of Edward, the boy for whom she died? He would become king at 9. He would die at 15. A sickly, intelligent child, manipulated by counselors, never truly allowed to live. His reign would be marked by fear, his death by uncertainty, and the throne would pass not to another son, but to 2 daughters, each born of the women Henry had cast aside. Jane's sacrifice, then, did not secure the dynasty. It only delayed its collapse. And so Jane remains the enigma of the 6, the queen who never fell from grace, because she did not live long enough to displease. The queen who gave her life for a son who would not survive to manhood. The queen who, in dying, proved that even when a woman gave Henry everything, it was still not enough to save her. She survived him. That alone should have been enough to rewrite her ending. She walked out of the royal court alive, wearing neither shackles nor shame, with her head still resting on her shoulders, while 5 other queens before her had either been discarded, exiled, or buried. Catherine Parr, Queen of England, Queen of Ireland, the 6th and final wife of Henry VIII, was not supposed to die young. She was not supposed to die in childbirth. But then again, none of them were. Catherine was 31 when she married the king, twice widowed. Well-read, pious, intelligent, and, by all accounts, reluctant. She had loved another man, Thomas Seymour, a brother to the late Queen Jane, a charming, ambitious figure with courtly eyes and whispered promises. But Henry wanted her, and in Tudor England, when the king wanted something or someone, it was no longer a matter of personal choice. So she swallowed her love, pressed her lips shut, and stepped into the palace as wife number 6. She read religious texts to Henry as his leg rotted and his moods darkened. She nursed him, calmed him, debated with him, and most dangerously taught herself to survive him. Unlike her predecessors, Catherine understood Henry not just as a man, but as a ruin. He was a king whose body had betrayed him, whose mind had turned inward, paranoid and scarred, whose throne stood not on the foundation of peace, but on the blood of queens. And yet, she endured. When he accused her of heresy, she threw herself at his feet and begged for mercy. When he doubted her loyalty, she wept until he relented. She knew how to live under tyranny. She had learned it from the ghosts that haunted the corridors. And then, miraculously, the tyrant died. It was the year 1547. Catherine Parr became the Dowager Queen, free at last. She reunited with the man she had loved before the crown had come between them. Thomas Seymour did not wait long. They married in secret. It was a strange kind of triumph. The queen who had once knelt before the most dangerous man in England now wed the man of her choosing. For the first time in her life, love was hers. Or so it seemed. But love is not always gentle. It is not always honest. Thomas, who had long desired power more than affection, soon turned his attention elsewhere, to the young Princess Elizabeth, Catherine's stepdaughter. The girl was just 14, clever and observant, and in the care of Catherine's household. What happened between Elizabeth and Thomas remains obscured by careful phrasing and redacted letters. But Catherine walked in on them, once his hands too familiar, her blush too sharp, and something in her broke. She was 35 when she found herself pregnant. It was her first pregnancy. After 3 marriages, after years of queenship, she would finally become a mother. But this was no glowing portrait of late-blooming joy. She was not strong. Her body had known only survival, not softness. And worse, she knew what childbirth meant. She had watched queens fade into fever, had read accounts of wombs torn open, of breath growing shallow in silence, blooming in royal beds. She had seen too much to hope without fear. In late summer, she gave birth to a daughter. They named her Mary. There is no record of Catherine ever holding the child with steady arms. Within 6 days, she was gone. Puerperal fever, the same silent predator that had stolen Jane Seymour, crept into her body. Infection coursed through her veins. Her skin flushed. Her belly ached. Her breath came in gasps. The midwives prayed. The physicians fumbled. And Catherine, who had survived kings, court, and the blade of suspicion, lay powerless against the oldest enemy of womanhood. She died on the 5th of September. In the year 1548, no ballads were written, no bells tolled for long. Her husband, Thomas Seymour, was arrested for treason the following year. Power, as always, was his downfall. He was executed at the Tower of London. A traitor's death. Their daughter, baby Mary, just months old, vanished from the record. Some say she was placed with a noble family and died young. Others claim she lived in obscurity, forgotten and unnamed. But history does not remember her. Her name is a footnote. Her fate a question mark. Her life a ghost. Catherine Parr had been more than a wife. She had been a reformer, a translator of psalms, a writer of books, a mother, in the spiritual sense, to Henry's scattered children. She had guided Princess Elizabeth through treacherous political waters, helped reconcile Mary to her father's memory, and held together the broken tapestry of a royal family that had torn itself apart with ambition and blood. And yet, in the end, her death was no different from theirs. She died alone, far from the throne she once shared. Not beneath a crown, but beneath sweat-soaked sheets in a borrowed bed, and the man she had loved betrayed her. The daughter she bore disappeared. The legacy she left behind was not in stone or steel, but in ink, the books she published, the faith she upheld, the steps she left behind for Elizabeth to follow. But she deserved more. She deserved to live. It is a bitter kind of symmetry, that even after escaping Henry, Catherine Parr could not escape the fate of the queens before her, as if the crown had left a curse in her blood, something that pulsed quietly until it found its moment to strike, a reminder that in Tudor England, a queen's most dangerous moment was not treason, nor scandal, nor fall from favor. It was childbirth. It was bringing life into the world, and being taken in return. She was not supposed to die. Not her. Not Charlotte. For once, the kingdom had placed its hopes not in a king or a warrior or a distant heir, but in a girl, a young woman born into chaos, carved from royal dysfunction, and raised beneath the shadow of scandal, who nonetheless managed to shine. She was the only legitimate grandchild of King George III, the only living bridge between the madness of her grandfather and the chaos of her uncles. Her smile softened a nation. Her laughter made people believe, if only for a moment, that the future might finally be gentle. Princess Charlotte Augusta of Wales was born into a family fractured beyond repair. Her father, George, the Prince of Wales, was a man of indulgence and cruelty, whose arranged marriage to Princess Caroline of Brunswick had collapsed in record time, leaving Charlotte to be shuttled between court factions like a diplomatic parcel. She lived with one parent and then the other, rarely both. Her early years marked by confusion and surveillance. But she grew up strong. She laughed too loudly for a princess. She stomped through puddles. She spoke her mind, and the people adored her for it. By the time she reached her 20s, Charlotte had become more than a royal daughter. She was the nation's beloved. Newspapers followed her with adoration. Artists painted her in soft light. She was the heart of England. And when she fell in love, not with a prince or a foreigner, but with Prince Leopold of Saxe-Coburg, a modest, gentleman from a relatively obscure house, the nation sighed with approval. Here, at last, was a royal marriage that seemed to be made not of treaties, but affection. They married in the spring of the year 1816. Crowds gathered to watch the carriage. People wept with joy. Charlotte, smiling from within, waved at them not as a sovereign, but as a girl who finally had something all queens craved, and few were granted choice. She became pregnant the following year. The bells rang. The papers printed her every movement. Midwives were consulted. Physicians debated. Every step of her pregnancy was public, followed not with scrutiny, but hope. England had known too much loss. Too many kings had gone mad. Too many heirs had died young or drunk or in disgrace. Charlotte was different. She was healthy. She was joyful. She was loved. Surely nothing could go wrong. But medicine, even in the 19th century, remained dangerously primitive. Her chief accoucheur, Sir Richard Croft, was a man of experience and reputation, but also fear. He worried that intervention could lead to infection. He feared forceps. And so when Charlotte began labor in early November of the year 1817, and the hours began to stretch into days, Croft waited, and waited, and waited, for over 50 hours. Charlotte labored. The baby was large, over 9 pounds. Her body was exhausted. Her eyes glazed with pain, but no instruments were used. No scalpel, no assistance. She finally delivered the child, a boy who was stillborn. The silence that followed was the first crack in the dream. Charlotte, weak but calm, was told the news. She nodded. She seemed to accept it. But within hours, her body began to turn. She vomited violently. Her Abdomen zwellt. She became pale. Her pulse fluttering. Internal bleeding had begun. Unseen and unstoppable. By 2:30 in the morning, Charlotte was gone. She was 21. The shock was seismic. England awoke to news that shattered something too fragile to name. The people had not lost a monarch. They had lost their daughter, their sister, their hope. Shops ran out of black cloth. The stock market dipped. Men wept openly in the streets. Even the hard hearts at court were softened. King George III, locked in his world of madness, and never fully understood what had happened. But the rest of the country did. Sir Richard Croft was inconsolable. 3 months later, he shot himself with a pistol, unable to live with the weight of his decision, the decision to do nothing. His suicide was called the triple obstetric tragedy. Mother, child, doctor, gone. Charlotte's death reshaped the monarchy. Her uncles, who had long lived in indulgence and taken no wives, were suddenly pressured to marry legitimate partners and produce heirs. The race to continue the bloodline became frantic, and from that desperation, a child was born, Victoria, the daughter of Edward, Duke of Kent, who would go on to reign for over 60 years and redefine the British Empire. But Victoria was not born of joy. She was born of a vacancy. Charlotte's story is not just the loss of a princess. It is the loss of a path not taken. Had she lived, had her son lived, the Victorian era may never have existed. The face on the coins might have been another. The history books would bear different titles, but more than that, the very shape of grief in England would have been softer. What lingers about Charlotte is not just the tragedy, but the intimacy of it. She was not a political queen or a distant figure carved in stone. She was young, hopeful, brave. Her story reminds us that in royal halls and golden cradles, death does not discriminate. The same silence that took queens in the Middle Ages still lurked in candlelit rooms centuries later, and though her portrait remains rosy-cheeked, bright-eyed, draped in silks, the truth is that she died as they did, alone, in agony, in service of a legacy that did not survive her. And so the nation mourned her not as a sovereign, but as something more sacred. A girl, a mother, a future that never arrived. They called it childbed fever, as if it were gentle, as if it were something a woman could sweat through and survive. And the way she might survive, labor pains or grief or silence, but it was never gentle. And it was never just a fever. It was a fire that lit behind the eyes and spread downward, flooding the belly with heat and poison, turning the womb, so recently opened in the sacred act of birth, into a chamber of rot. The royal birthing rooms may have been gilded, may have echoed with Latin prayers and soft-footed courtiers, but they were tombs waiting to be used. And the killers, more often than not, walked in smiling. They were the doctors, the accoucheurs, the trusted hands of kings, men with polished boots and gold-handled instruments, who had read Latin texts and been trained in the most modern ideas of the age, but who did not believe in germs, who moved from one bed to another without ever washing their hands, who carried death beneath their fingernails and pressed it gently into the torn flesh of women they were sworn to save. The women never knew. How could they? Bacteria had no name, no shape, no language. It rode on the breath of a nurse. It lingered on linens never boiled. It floated in the air above blood-soaked straw that had not been changed for days. Puerperal fever. They eventually called it, but long before that name entered the medical books, it had entered the beds of queens. Jane Seymour, Catherine Parr, Elizabeth of York, Charlotte, Augusta. Different centuries. Different palaces. The same fate. A woman gives birth. Her lips dry and cracked. Her body torn. The child is taken alive, dead, or dying, and the room settles into silence. At first, all seems calm. Visitors come and go. Courtiers bow. The king breathes again. But then, one day, his skin burns. She begins to tremble. Her pulse races. Her belly aches. A sour smell fills the room. And suddenly, everyone knows, without saying the word, that she is not recovering, that the birth was not the end but only the beginning of her death. And it was not just the fever. There were other invisible killers. Blood loss. Slow and quiet. Soaking through sheets, while the patient smiled and thanked God for a safe delivery. Clots that lodged in the lungs. Strokes brought on by the strain of labor. Sepsis. Creeping from torn tissue into the bloodstream. And worst of all, the indifference. The long hours when no one came. The silence in the hallway as the fever spiked. The refusal to let midwives intervene because they were women. The belief that a noble woman should be delivered by men of learning, even when those men had never themselves bled, or screamed, or torn. There were no antiseptics, no antibiotics, no anesthesia. Chloroform would not arrive until the reign of Queen Victoria. Penicillin would not be discovered until centuries later. The womb was a mystery. The placenta, a puzzle. The uterus, a battleground no one understood. And so childbirth, even for a queen, was little more than a ritualized gamble, with the odds stacked quietly against her. And if she died, the kingdom wept. The king remarried. The cycle resumed. The birthing chambers of the royals were not places of joy. They were theaters of risk, filled with candlelight and oil burners. They stank of sweat, blood, urine, and herbs meant to ward off evil. The queen would be confined for weeks before birth, isolated, kept in darkened rooms, told to pray and rest, wrapped in rituals meant to keep her safe. But the danger was not in the shadows. It was in the hands that touched her, the cloths that wiped her brow, the sponges soaked in rosewater and reused without rinsing, the fingers that reached into her without gloves. She may have worn a crown. She may have had 100 servants, but she was still, in the end, a woman alone on a bed, in pain, in peril, and surrounded by men who did not know enough to save her. What's most cruel is this: the queens were the lucky ones. They had physicians. They had chambers warmed by fire. They had silk pillows and silver bowls. But the same deaths were happening in cottages and farmhouses, in stone huts and straw-lined hovels. And no one remembered those names. No one carved their initials into royal tombs or mourned them with black armbands across a nation. For every Elizabeth or Jane or Charlotte who died, there were thousands of unnamed women who bled just the same without ceremony, without prayers, without even a grave. So the question becomes, what is royalty? If it cannot shield its women from the most common fate, what is power? If it ends the same way with a closed door, a scream in the night, and the sound of a child wailing while its mother slips quietly away, these were not deaths of rebellion, nor assassination, nor treason. They were deaths of routine, of biology, of stubborn ignorance. And they happened again and again, century after century, with no parade of progress to interrupt the pattern, even as science marched forward, even as doctors argued and debated and drew charts. The women kept dying. Their blood stained every age of monarchy. No crown ever saved them. No oath ever spared them. No dynasty ever honored them enough to listen. They were not warriors. And yet they died in battles, not on fields of mud and steel, but in chambers laced with silk, not by sword or arrow, but by fever and rupture and silence. And though no war memorial bears their names, these women queens, princesses, consorts fell for the same reason soldiers fall, because someone told them they must, because there was a kingdom to protect, a legacy to continue, a name to preserve, and they were the ones chosen to pay for it. The expectation was simple and absolute. They must give birth, not just once, not twice, but again and again, until a male heir was produced, until the line was secured, until the realm could rest, knowing that the next generation of rulers had been safely born. And if they died in the process, then let them be mourned. Let them be honored. But let them be replaced. The wheel would turn. The crown would pass. And another woman would step into the same bed, lie down in the same pain, and face the same fate. What made it more brutal was how dressed it all was in beauty. The tapestries, the prayers, the long processions, the christening gowns stitched with golden thread. The court spoke of duty, of grace, of divine purpose. But behind the velvet curtains, a woman wept into a blood-soaked mattress. Her hands clawed at the sheets. Her voice begged for help that would not come. And all the while, outside the door, men waited not for news of her safety, but for confirmation, had it been a boy, even now. Centurilateur. And the records, remember, the child, not the mother, the heir, not the body that tore to bring him here, the reign, not the grave that made it possible. Elizabeth of York is remembered for birthing a king, Jane Seymour for birthing Edward, Charlotte for not birthing anyone who survived, Catherine Parr. It remembered more for being the one who lived, though in the end she died in the same way as the others. Their children inherited nations. they inherited nothing. And it was not just physical. The sacrifice was not only in blood and bone, it was in identity. The moment a royal woman married, she ceased to belong to herself. Her womb was no longer hers. Her time, her health, her very heartbeat, all belonged to the crown. And when that heartbeat faltered, when it failed, the crown moved on. A nation cannot wait. A dynasty must survive. But where does that leave the women who built it with their bodies beneath marble, behind locked doors, inside stories that are always told from someone else's point of view? They were the foundation. No one saw. The architecture beneath the pageantry. The queens whose reigns were measured not in laws passed or battles won, but in contractions, in months of confinement, in the cries of newborns, and the silence that sometimes followed. They ruled for a moment between the sheets, and then their reign ended with a whisper and a midwife's trembling hands. The tragedy is not just that they died. It is that their deaths were expected, acceptable, written into the script. No one was shocked. No one stopped the cycle. And for every royal woman whose name survived, how many countless others vanished into the folds of history? How many noble women, duchesses, ladies of the court, fell in the same way, buried without song, remembered only by the children they barely had time to hold? And what of the queens who lived, who survived the childbed but carried the trauma with them, who watched other women die and knew it could be them next time? There are no paintings of their nightmares, no histories of their trembling hands, and yet they walk through palace halls like ghosts, bleeding in secret, smiling through pain, performing fertility like theater. It would take centuries for things to change. It would take science, courage, loss. And even then, the change came slowly, one funeral at a time. But perhaps now, in this moment, with all the stories laid bare, we can finally say their names not just as mothers or wives or bearers of heirs, but as women, as lives, as individuals who deserved more than a quiet death and a cold memorial. Isabella, Mary, Elizabeth, Jane, Catherine, Charlotte. Each of them walked into the royal birthing room with hope. Each of them paid with something irreversible. And the world, as it always does, moved on. But we don't have to. We can remember.